On June 25, 1983, in the open meadow wilderness of Montana's Elkhorn Mountains, 4-year-old Nylene K. Marshall played barefoot near beaver dams while her family relaxed at a summer picnic. In the seconds it took for the other children to turn around, Nylene vanished. 2 years later, anonymous letters began arriving from the Midwest, written by someone who claimed to know exactly what became of Kay. Who wrote them, why they stopped, and what truly happened in that meadow remains unanswered. If this story stays with you, tell us where you're listening from. Helena, Montana sits in a valley surrounded by mountains that have witnessed more than a century of mining booms and busts, wilderness expeditions, and the kind of rugged independence that defines the American West. In 1983, it was a city of about 25,000 people, the kind of place where families knew their neighbors by name, where the local diner on Main Street served the same breakfast specials it had been serving since the 1950s, where the five and dime store still had creaking wooden floors and glass jars filled with penny candy that children would press their noses against while deciding how to spend their allowance. Nancy Marshall was in her 30s, though her exact age was never consistently reported in the various newspaper accounts and police reports that would later document her daughter's disappearance. She was the kind of mother who volunteered for every church activity, who baked cookies for school fundraisers, and never just bought store-bought ones, even though that would have been easier, who knew all the other kids in the Frank neighborhood by name, and kept an eye on them when they played in the prison street, who would drive other people's children to soccer practice or piano lessons when their own parents were working and couldn't get away. Kim Marshall was quieter, harder to read, the kind of man who could be in a room for an hour, and afterward you'd struggle to remember if he'd actually been there or not. He was tall and lean with dark hair that was starting to thin at the crown, and he favored flannel shirts and work boots regardless of the season or occasion. The marriage was Nancy's second. Nylene's biological father, William Roy Briscoe, wasn't in the picture in any meaningful way. The divorce had happened when Nylene was still a baby, barely old enough to have formed any memories of him, and Briscoe had apparently moved out of state and had minimal contact with his daughter, sending child support checks when he remembered, but otherwise existing as more of an abstract concept than a real presence in Nylene's life. Nylene K. Marshall, born September 18, 1978 in Orange, California, was small for her age, just 29 pounds and 3 feet 2 inches tall, at a time when most 4-year-olds were closer to 40 pounds and 3.5 feet. The pediatrician had noted at her last checkup that she was tracking below the 5th percentile for both height and weight, though there was no indication of any underlying health problem, just genetics and individual variation that meant she'd probably always be on the smaller side. She had brown hair that fell in soft waves to her shoulders, the kind of hair that tangled easily and that Nancy would spend patient minutes brushing through each morning before school or church, working out the knots while Nylene squirmed and complained that it hurt. Her eyes were a striking blue that seemed too large for her small face, giving her an almost otherworldly quality in photographs, the kind of distinctive feature that made strangers stop Nancy in grocery stores to comment on what a beautiful child she had. She had dimples that showed when she smiled, deep indentations in both cheeks that made her look even younger than she was, that gave her face an innocent sweetness that adults found irresistible. That Saturday morning, June 25, 1983, began the way most summer Saturdays began for the Marshall family. Nancy woke early, around 6:30, before the heat of the day had built up, and before the children were awake and demanding breakfast and attention. She moved quietly through the house, starting a pot of coffee, and beginning to pull together supplies for the field: day bread for sandwiches, sliced turkey and cheese from the deli counter at Safeway, the good pickles that Kim liked, potato chips, fruit that wouldn't get too messy, in a cooler juice, boxes for the kids, maybe some cookies for dessert. She worked with the efficient movements of someone who'd packed dozens of picnics and knew exactly what was needed, what would hold up well in a cooler for several hours, what the kids would actually eat versus what they'd ignore. Kim came downstairs around 7, already showered and dressed in his usual flannel and jeans, and started loading the radio equipment into the truck without being asked. The portable antenna that broke down into sections for easy transport. The battery-powered transceiver wrapped carefully in an old blanket to protect it from jostling the folding table they'd use as a work surface, the camping chairs they'd sit in while making contacts with other operators scattered across North America. He worked methodically and in silence, checking each piece of equipment as he loaded it, making sure nothing had been forgotten, making sure batteries were charged and cables were coiled properly. The field day was partly social, but it was also partly practical. A chance to test equipment under real conditions to practice the skills they might need if disaster struck and normal communication systems went down to maintain the networks. And relationships that could literally save lives during forest fires or winter storms. Around 7:30, the children started appearing, drawn downstairs by the smell of coffee and the sounds of activity that meant something interesting was happening. Nylene came down in her favorite yellow t-shirt, the one with the little pocket on the front that was just big enough to hold a tiny toy or an interesting rock, and a pair of blue shorts that were getting a little tight in the waist. Because she was growing, though not growing as quickly as other children her age. Her feet were bare, and when Nancy noticed, she opened her mouth to remind Nylene to put on shoes, then closed it again without saying anything. By 8:30, the truck was loaded and the family was ready to go. Nancy had made sandwiches and wrapped them carefully in wax paper, had filled a large cooler with ice and drinks, had packed a smaller cooler with snacks that the kids could access without having to ask permission. She'd remembered sunscreen and bug spray, and a first aid kit with bandages and antibiotic ointment, and children's Tylenol just in case. They drove out Warm Springs Creek Road into the Elkhorn Mountains, following the familiar route they'd taken dozens of times before for previous field days and fishing trips and Sunday afternoon drives when the weather was nice and the family felt like getting out of the house. The road started out paved 2 lanes winding through the foothills past ranch houses and small hobby farms where horses grazed in pastures and chickens scratched in the dirt. The road climbed steadily up into the mountains, winding through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir that grew so thick in places that the road became a tunnel of green shade where the temperature dropped noticeably and the air smelled like Christmas trees year-round. The windows were rolled down, and warm air rushed through the truck cab, carrying the scent of pine resin and wildflowers, and the slightly dusty smell of dirt roads in summer. The kids were excited in the way children get excited about any break in routine, pointing out landmarks they recognized from previous trips. The big rock that looked vaguely like a bear, if you squinted and tilted your head, the turnoff to the fishing spot where they'd gone last month. And Kim had caught a rainbow trout big enough to keep for dinner. The place where they'd once seen a deer standing in the middle of the road, who'd watched them approach without moving until the truck was almost close enough to touch, and then had bounded away into the forest in 3 elegant leaps. By the time they reached the meadow around 9:30 in the morning, several other families had already arrived and were in various stages of setting up their equipment. Nancy and Kim found a good spot near the middle of the meadow, not too close to other groups but close enough to be social, and began the familiar routine of setting up their equipment. "Hey Bob, I just made contact with a station in Oregon." Or, "Does anyone know if there's interference on this frequency? Or is it just me?" Children ran between the groups of adults, initially playing with their own siblings and family members, but gradually mixing into larger groups as they recognized friends from previous field days or from school or church. Someone had brought a frisbee that sailed back and forth across the meadow. Someone else had a football. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon on June 25, 1983, one of the older children came running up to where Nancy was sitting, moving fast enough and with enough obvious urgency that Nancy immediately felt her stomach tighten with worry even before she heard what the child had to say. "We can't find Nylene. She was behind us by the creek and now she's gone. We looked, but we can't find her anywhere." Nancy stood up quickly, brushing grass and sandwich crumbs off her jeans, her mind immediately running through the possibilities. Her first thought wasn't panic, it was mild annoyance, mixed with concern. Nylene knew better than to wander off alone. She'd been told 100 times to stay with the group, to not go exploring by herself, to make sure someone always knew where she was. But 4-year-olds had short attention spans, and poor impulse control, and a tendency to get distracted by anything interesting. Nylene had probably found something that caught her attention. A particularly colorful butterfly, a frog sitting on a rock, some wildflowers she wanted to pick, and had gotten so absorbed in examining whatever it was that she'd lost track of where the other children had gone, and now couldn't figure out how to find her way back. Nancy walked toward the creek area with Kim moving quickly but not running, calling Nyleen's name in a voice that was loud but not yet frightened, the kind of calling your child voice that parents use when they're annoyed, but not genuinely worried. Nyleen, time to come back, honey. Nyleen, where are you? The meadow stretched out in front of them, golden in the afternoon, light grass and wildflowers waving slightly in the breeze. No small figure in a yellow shirt appeared. Nancy called again, louder this time, and heard the first edge of real worry creep into her own voice, heard the shift from annoyance to something closer to fear. Nyleen, this isn't funny. You need to come back right now. Kim walked ahead toward the creek, scanning the area with a systematic attention that was characteristic of how he approached most problems, looking for any sign of movement, any flash of yellow that might indicate where Nyleen had gone. Other members of the radio club noticed the commotion and started joining the search, moving away from their equipment and their lunches, fanning out across the meadow in an expanding circle that grew wider as more people realized something was wrong. They checked the area near the beaver dams thoroughly, walking along both banks of the creek, looking in the small pools of water behind the dams for any sign that a child might have fallen in, though the water was shallow enough and slow-moving enough that drowning seemed unlikely. They looked inside the old cabin ruins at the edge of the meadow, though there was barely enough structure left standing to hide anything. They walked through the tall grass, calling Nyleen's name over and over, expecting at any moment to see her pop up from where she'd been sitting, examining a bug or a flower, completely unaware that everyone was looking for her. The search had a casual quality at first, people making reassuring comments to Nancy about how kids this age loved to hide, about how she'd probably just wandered a little farther than she intended and would be back any minute, feeling sheepish about causing all this worry. But as 15 minutes stretched into 30, and then 30 minutes stretched into 45, the atmosphere began to change in subtle ways. Voices grew sharper with anxiety. People stopped smiling. The reassuring comments became less frequent and less convincing. Someone mentioned the abandoned mine shafts that dotted this part of the mountains, and suddenly everyone was moving faster, calling louder, organizing themselves into more systematic search teams rather than just wandering around randomly. The men from the radio club started checking areas beyond the immediate meadow, pushing into the tree line where the forest grew dense, looking for any indication that a small child might have wandered into the woods and gotten turned around. The women stayed closer to the meadow, continuing to call Nyleen's name, searching through the tall grass on hands and knees in case she'd fallen and hurt herself and was lying somewhere unable to respond. Kim walked back to their truck and got on the radio, using the ham equipment to contact someone back in Helena who could relay a message to emergency services. The radio crackled with static and crosstalk as Kim explained the situation with a calmness that might have been admirable or might have been disturbing depending on how you interpreted it. A 4-year-old girl missing in the Elkhorn Mountains, last seen approximately 1 hour ago, near Maupin Creek in the meadow, where the Capital City Radio Club was holding its field day search, already in progress but needing professional assistance and coordination. Nancy stood near the creek, with her hands pressed flat against her mouth, as if physically holding back the scream that was building in her chest, watching more and more people scatter across the meadow, searching an area that seemed impossibly large and impossibly small at the same time. How could a child disappear in an open meadow on a clear afternoon? And then there was the possibility that nobody wanted to voice out loud yet, but that was already forming in the backs of people's minds, the possibility that this wasn't an accident at all, that something had happened to Nyleen that didn't involve wandering or falling or getting lost, that someone had taken her deliberately and was even now driving away with her while everyone searched the meadow and the creek and the forest, looking in all the wrong places. By the time the first Jefferson County Sheriff's deputy arrived at the scene, pulling his patrol car as far down the dirt Forest Service road as the vehicle's clearance would allow, and then hiking the final quarter-mile to the meadow, Nyleen had been missing for nearly 2 hours. The deputy's name was Martinez. He took one look at the dozens of people scattered across the meadow at the grass that had been trampled flat in places by searchers. He pulled Nancy and Kim aside, away from the growing crowd of anxious volunteers who were standing around waiting for direction, and started asking the basic questions he'd been trained to ask in situations like this. What was Nyleen wearing? Nancy's voice shook as she answered, yellow t-shirt with a little pocket on the front. Blue shorts? No shoes, because she never wanted to wear shoes in summer, and Nancy had let her go barefoot because it seemed harmless. And now, that decision seemed like the worst mistake Nancy had ever made. What did Nylene look like? Brown hair, blue eyes, very small for her age. Nancy continued the words, coming faster now, as if speed could somehow bring her daughter back. She's got a chipped front tooth on the top left from when she fell off the porch. She's got a little mole right above her left eyebrow. She has dimples when she smiles. She's only 4 years old. She's just a baby. She wouldn't wander off on her own. She knows better. Something must have happened to her. You have to find her. You have to find her right now before it gets dark. Deputy Martinez wrote everything down in his notepad. No immediate indication of foul play, but also no indication that this was simply a case of a kid who'd wandered off and gotten turned around because 2 hours was too long for a 4-year-old to stay hidden in an area this size, unless something had happened to prevent her from responding to the dozens of people calling her name. He radioed for backup for search and rescue teams for every available resource the county could mobilize on a Saturday afternoon. He asked the gathered families to continue searching, but to try to avoid disturbing potential evidence, any more than it already had been. Don't move anything you find. Don't pick anything up. Call out immediately if anyone noticed anything that might belong to Nylene or that seemed out of place or unusual. He established a basic command post near where the Marshall family had been set up, using their truck as a central landmark that people could orient themselves to. He started taking names and contact information from everyone present, knowing that witnesses would need to be interviewed more thoroughly later, that investigators would want to know who'd been at the meadow that day and what they'd seen and when they'd last spotted Nylene. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks and shadows grew longer across the meadow, more law enforcement arrived. Additional deputies from Jefferson County, volunteers from Lewis and Clark County Search and Rescue who'd been called in to assist Forest Service personnel who knew the area and could provide information about terrain and hazards. The Jefferson County Sheriff himself, Tom Dawson, showed up around 6 o'clock. A career officer in his mid-50s with the weathered face and calm demeanor of someone who'd spent a lifetime dealing with difficult situations and who'd learned not to let his emotions show no matter what he was feeling inside. Search and rescue arrived with professional equipment, detailed topographic maps of the area marked with grid coordinates, handheld radios that all the search teams could monitor so they could stay in contact, plans for expanding the search systematically in concentric circles moving outward from the point where Nylene had last been seen. They brought specialized gear for checking the abandoned mine shafts, ropes and harnesses, and powerful flashlights and gas detectors to check for bad air in the tunnels before anyone went down. By sunset, more than 100 people were actively searching the Elkhorn Mountains, their voices echoing across the valley as they called Nylene's name over and over into the gathering darkness. By nightfall, that number had grown to several hundred as word spread through Helena, and volunteers began arriving from town. Members of the LDS Church who'd heard during evening services that one of their congregation needed help. Neighbors who'd seen the news coverage on the 6 o'clock broadcasts. Complete strangers who'd heard about a missing 4-year-old and felt compelled to do something, even if it was just walking through the forest calling a name. And by the time the temperature dropped into the low 40s and heavy rain began to fall around midnight, Nancy Marshall was still standing in the meadow, absolutely refusing to leave, despite people begging her to go sit in someone's truck, where it was warm and dry. Her clothes soaked completely, through her voice hoarse and cracking from calling her daughter's name into the darkness for hours, convinced on some deep, irrational level that if she just stayed there in the meadow, if she just kept calling, Nylene would hear her mother's voice and somehow find her way home. The search that mobilized over the following days and stretched into more than a week became one of the largest search and rescue operations in Montana history, the kind of massive, coordinated effort that's usually reserved for plane crashes or natural disasters. By Sunday morning, more than 1,000 volunteers had shown up to help the entire congregation of multiple LDS churches from across the region, who'd been asked during Sunday services to help search for one of their own fellow ham. Radio operators from all over Montana, and even from neighboring states who'd heard about the situation through their networks. Neighbors and co-workers and people who'd never met the Marshalls but who had children of their own and couldn't imagine what the family was going through. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office coordinated with Lewis and Clark County Search and Rescue with the U.S. Forest Service, which had jurisdiction over much of the search area, with volunteer search and rescue organizations from multiple counties with the Montana National Guard, which provided helicopter support. They established a proper command post with maps spread out on folding tables with radio equipment and phone lines, connecting them to various agencies and support services, with a system for tracking which areas had been searched and which still needed attention, with team leaders coordinating groups of volunteers and making sure everyone knew where they were supposed to be and what they were supposed to be doing. Sheriff Dawson arrived on scene early Sunday morning after getting maybe 2 hours of fitful sleep, and he spent several minutes just looking at the topographic maps spread out on the tables, trying to calculate odds that he already knew weren't good. A 4-year-old child barefoot wearing only light summer clothing consisting of a t-shirt and shorts exposed overnight to temperatures that had dropped into the low 40s with heavy rain that had started around midnight and continued for several hours. The survival window for a small child in those conditions was measured in hours, not days. Hypothermia would set in quickly when you were that small and had minimal body fat to provide insulation. Getting soaked by rain would accelerate heat loss dramatically. If Nylene had simply wandered into the forest and gotten lost, if this was a straightforward case of a child who'd walked farther than she intended and couldn't find her way back, then she was almost certainly already dead from exposure. Around 9 o'clock Sunday morning, Dawson pulled Nancy and Kim aside for a conversation he'd been dreading since he'd arrived on scene. They stood away from the command post, away from the volunteers who were gathering for the day's search assignments near the edge of the meadow, where they could have something approximating privacy, even though everyone could see them, talking and probably guess what was being discussed. Dawson had been a law enforcement officer for more than 30 years. He delivered bad news to families more times than he could count news about accidents and crimes and tragedies. It never got easier. If anything, it got harder as you got older and had more experience because you knew exactly how devastating the words you were about to say would be. You could see the future branching out from this moment, and you knew that nothing would ever be the same for these people. "We need to talk about reality here," Dawson said, his voice gentle but firm, the voice of someone who'd learned that sometimes kindness meant being direct rather than softening the truth. "The weather last night was bad, real bad for a small child with no protection from the elements. If Nylene was out in that rain with the temperature dropping the way it did with nothing but a t-shirt and shorts." He paused, watched Nancy's face start to crumble, watched Kim's expression remain almost blank, in a way that Dawson found oddly disturbing, and forced himself to continue, because someone had to say this out loud, and it might as well be him. Nancy looked at him with eyes that were red-rimmed and swollen from crying eyes that hadn't seen sleep in more than 24 hours. Her voice when she spoke was raw and barely above a whisper. "You're saying you think she's gone. I'm saying that survival in those conditions is virtually impossible for a 4-year-old child. I'm saying that we have to be realistic about the chances even as we continue to hope for a miracle. I'm saying that the next hours and days are going to be extraordinarily difficult no matter what happens." Nancy's voice changed, then went from raw and broken to something harder, something that had steel underneath it. "Then you keep searching until you find her, Sheriff. Dead or alive, you find my daughter. You don't stop looking until you find her, and you can show me exactly what happened." "Do you understand me?" Dawson nodded, feeling a respect for this woman's fierce determination mixed with profound sadness at what was almost certainly false hope. "Yes, ma'am. We'll keep searching." The FBI became involved on Monday, deploying resources from their Salt Lake City field office, bringing expertise in child abduction cases and forensic analysis that went beyond what local law enforcement could provide. They brought one of their most successful search dogs, a German Shepherd named Duke, who had an impressive record: 37 missing persons located over his 6-year career as a search and rescue dog, including lost hikers and Alzheimer's patients who'd wandered away from care facilities and children who'd run away from home. Duke's handler was a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been working with search dogs for 15 years and who had complete confidence in her partner's abilities. Sarah gave Duke one of Nylene's shirts that Nancy had brought from home, letting the dog get a thorough scent while speaking to him in the calm, authoritative voice that let him know this was serious work, not play. Then she walked Duke to the area near Maupin Creek, where the children said Nylene had last been seen, to the spot where the group had been playing before they decided to head back to the main meadow. The moment Duke caught Nylene's scent, Among all the other human scents that contaminated the area, his entire demeanor changed in the way that working dogs shift when they're locked onto a task. His body went tense and focused. His tail straightened out behind him like a rudder. His nose dropped to the ground and he began moving purposefully through the grass with Sarah following behind him, letting out more leash, trusting Duke to do what he'd been trained to do. Behind them, a small group of law enforcement officers and volunteers followed at a respectful distance of maybe 20 yards. Everyone quiet, everyone barely breathing, everyone holding on to hope that Duke would lead them to Nylene hiding. Somewhere in the forest. Maybe injured, but alive, maybe sheltered, under a fallen log or in a rocky overhang, frightened, but waiting to be rescued. Duke tracked through the meadow for maybe 50 yards, moving in a relatively straight line away from the creek toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing. His pace was steady and confident, the movements of a dog who knew exactly what he was following and where it was leading. Then abruptly Duke stopped. His head came up from the ground. He circled the area where he'd stopped, sniffing frantically at the grass and the ground and the air, clearly searching for the scent he'd been following just seconds before but unable to find it. He circled wider, covering maybe a 15-foot radius, then came back to the same spot where the scent had ended. He looked up at Sarah with an expression that working dog handlers learned to read, an expression that said the scent was simply gone and he didn't understand why. Sarah Chen watched her dog with a sinking feeling born of experience, a feeling she'd had before in cases that hadn't ended well. She knew what this meant. She'd seen it happen in other searches. She turned to the deputies who'd been following them, her face carefully neutral even though her stomach was churning. The scent ends here. It doesn't fade gradually the way it would if she'd walked away on her own feet. It just stops. Right at this spot. One of the younger deputies, someone who clearly hadn't done many search operations, asked the question, even though the more experienced officers standing nearby already knew the answer and were exchanging grim looks. What does that mean exactly? It means she was picked up at this spot. Someone lifted her from the ground right here, probably carried her away. Once her feet weren't touching the ground anymore, there's no scent trail for Duke to follow. Sarah looked around, orienting herself relative to the meadow and the forest and the road system that served this area. Forest Service Road is maybe 70-80 yards through those trees. If someone had a vehicle parked there, they could have grabbed her, carried her to the car, put her inside, and been driving away in under 2 minutes. The other children said they were about 100 yards ahead of her when she disappeared. By the time they turned around and realized she was missing, by the time they got back to tell the parents, by the time anyone started actually searching, we're talking at least 15 or 20 minutes. Whoever took her could have been 5 or 10 miles away by then. Could have been back on the highway heading to Helena or Boulder, or anywhere really. The implications settled over the group like a physical weight, like the temperature had just dropped 10 degrees even though the sun was shining and the morning was warming up nicely. This wasn't a lost child case anymore. This was an abduction. Somewhere out there, someone had Nylene Marshall, and the window for finding her alive, which had already been narrow given the weather and the exposure, was now almost certainly closed, unless the abductor was keeping her alive, which brought up a whole different set of terrible possibilities about why someone would take a 4-year-old girl and what they might be doing with her. The most dangerous and labor-intensive work of the entire search operation involved the abandoned mine shafts that were scattered throughout the Elkhorn Mountains like lethal booby traps hidden under brush and fallen logs. There were dozens of them within the search area, maybe hundreds if you counted all the small prospect holes and test shafts that miners had dug in the late 1800s and early 1900s when gold and silver fever was high, and every prospector thought they might be about to strike it rich. Most of the shafts weren't marked on any map. Most of them were just vertical or near vertical holes in the ground, often concealed by decades of brush growth or fallen trees dropping anywhere from 20 feet to several hundred feet straight down into darkness, where the miners had followed promising veins of ore until the veins played out, or the miners ran out of money, or the shafts filled with water or bad air made them too dangerous to work. A small child could easily fall into one of these shafts, especially a barefoot child picking her way through unfamiliar terrain. Once you fell in, there'd be no way to climb back out without specialized equipment. The walls were often smooth rock or crumbly ore that wouldn't hold your weight, and the shafts were too deep to climb even if you had something to grip. You'd be trapped at the bottom in complete darkness, possibly injured from the fall, waiting to be found. Teams of volunteers, many of them experienced cavers or rock climbers who understood the risks and had the technical skills needed, took on the grim task of checking every shaft they could locate. The process was methodical but terrifying. They'd approach each shaft carefully, calling down into the darkness, first listening for any response, a cry for help, a whimper, any sound that might indicate someone was down there. If there was no response, someone would have to go down to physically verify the shaft was empty. They'd set up rope systems and harnesses, test the stability of the rock around the shaft, have safety protocols in place in case something went wrong. Then someone would rappel into tunnels that hadn't been disturbed in more than a century, where the support timbers had rotted away and the walls could collapse without warning, where the air might be filled with methane or carbon dioxide or simply depleted of oxygen, where the footing at the bottom was treacherous and you could easily break an ankle or leg if you landed wrong. They'd shine powerful flashlights into side passages, and along the walls check ledges where a body might have landed if someone had fallen partway down. Look for any sign that a child had been there. A scrap of yellow fabric, a small shoe that had come off during a fall, anything. They found rusty mining equipment, old pickaxes and ore carts and lanterns. They found the bones of animals that had fallen in decades ago and never found their way back out. They found collapsed sections where further progress was impossible without excavation equipment. They found puddles of stagnant water and air so stale it made your lungs burn. They didn't find Nylene. By the end of the first week, the search had taken on the precision and organization of a military operation. Every accessible part of the Elkhorn Mountains within a 5-mile radius of the meadow had been divided into grid sections on the detailed topographic maps, and each section had been systematically searched by teams who reported back on exactly what area they'd covered and what they'd found or not found. Helicopters from the Montana National Guard had flown grid patterns over the entire area multiple times, their infrared cameras scanning for any heat signature that might indicate a person living or recently deceased. The cameras were sensitive enough to detect a living person even under tree cover, even in dense brush, as long as that person was generating body heat that was different from the ambient temperature. The helicopters had found wildlife, deer and elk, a black bear with cubs that sent searchers in that area scrambling for safety, even a mountain lion that was probably more scared of the helicopters than the humans were of it. They hadn't found Nylene. Ground teams had walked what felt like thousands of miles over the course of that week, calling Nylene's name until their voices gave out and they had to be rotated out to rest, pushing through brush and deadfall that hadn't been disturbed in years, checking every conceivable place where a small child might hide or get stuck, or fall, or take shelter. The beaver dams on Maupin Creek had been systematically dismantled. Every log and stick pulled away and examined every pool behind them, searched and drained and searched again. The old cabin ruins had been torn apart completely, every board lifted, every nail pulled the ground underneath, dug up in case somehow a child had been buried there. Search teams had used metal detectors to sweep the area in case Nylene had been wearing any jewelry, or had been carrying coins or keys or anything else metal in her pockets that might have been dropped and then covered by leaves or dirt. And they'd found nothing. No piece of clothing, no small footprint that could definitively be attributed to Nylene's bare feet, no scrap of yellow fabric caught on a branch, no strand of brown hair, no personal items, no blood, no disturbed earth that might indicate where a body had been buried. No sign whatsoever that Nylene K. Marshall had ever existed beyond that spot where Duke's trail had ended and where investigators now believed she'd been picked up and carried away by someone who'd been watching and waiting for exactly the right moment. 10 days after Nylene disappeared, Sheriff Dawson stood in front of the command post while news cameras from Helena and Butte and Billings recorded, and while exhausted searchers gathered around their faces, showing the emotional and physical toll of 10 days of relentless effort that had produced nothing. The meadow that had been so beautiful and peaceful on that Saturday afternoon when families gathered for the radio club field day now looked trampled and worn, the grass beaten down to mud in places by thousands of feet, trash accumulating. Despite efforts to keep the area clean, the whole scene taking round on a grim, shabby quality that matched everyone's mood. We've conducted one of the most extensive search and rescue operations in Montana history, Dawson said, his voice carrying across the crowd that had gone completely silent. We've had over 1,000 volunteers give their time and effort. We've had professional search and rescue teams from multiple counties, FBI resources and expertise, search dogs with impressive track records, helicopters with thermal imaging equipment that can detect a person from hundreds of feet in the air. We've searched every accessible square mile of these mountains, many areas multiple times. We've checked every abandoned mine shaft we could locate. We've done everything humanly possible to find Nylene Marshall. He paused, his jaw working as if he was physically chewing on the words he had to say next. Words that felt like admitting defeat, even though he knew intellectually that they'd done everything right, that sometimes you do everything right and still don't get the outcome you want. The reality we have to face is that survival was virtually impossible given the weather conditions on the night Nylene disappeared. A 4-year-old child, barefoot, wearing only light summer clothing, exposed to temperatures in the low 40s with several hours of heavy rain. The medical consensus from doctors I've consulted with who specialize in perchiate, hypothermia, and exposure is that survival beyond the first 8 to 10 hours was not realistic. We have to face the likelihood that Nylene did not survive her first night in these mountains. He took a breath, looked out at the crowd of volunteers who'd given so much of themselves over the past 10 days. The official active search operation is being suspended as of 5 p.m. today. The case remains completely open and active. From an investigation standpoint, this is not us giving up. This is us acknowledging that we've searched everywhere a person could physically search, and continuing to put volunteers at risk in dangerous terrain is not going to change the outcome. If new information comes to light, if someone finds something, if we get any kind of lead, we will resume searching immediately. But for now, it's time to let the professionals handle the investigation while we all go home and try to process what's happened here. Nancy Marshall, standing at the edge of the crowd, with Kim's hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that looked supportive, but that Nancy experienced as a weight trying to pull her down, felt something fundamental crack inside her chest when she heard Dawson say those words that officially ended the search. She'd been living on pure adrenaline and desperate hope for 10 days straight, getting maybe an hour or two of sleep each night when exhaustion finally forced her to close her eyes, refusing to eat more than a few bites of whatever someone managed to force into her hands, spending every waking moment either actively searching or standing in the meadow, calling Nylene's name because she believed on some deep, irrational level that a mother's voice could reach through any barrier, could pull a lost child back from wherever they'd gone. She spoke without consciously deciding to speak, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. "My daughter is not dead." The statement hung in the air, defiant and desperate and delusional, all at once. "You didn't find a body. That means she's not in these mountains. That means someone took her and she's still alive somewhere, and I don't care what you think is likely or unlikely or impossible. I am not giving up on my daughter." For 2 years after the official search ended, Nancy Marshall lived in that terrible liminal space between hope and grief, unable to mourn because there was no body to prove death, unable to move forward because there were no answers that would allow any kind of closure or acceptance. She became a familiar figure in downtown Helena, putting up flyers on every telephone pole and community bulletin board, standing outside the Safeway and the mall, handing out photocopied images of Nylene's face to anyone who would take to them. She contacted every missing children's organization she could find, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, that had just been formed in 1984 in the aftermath of the Adam Walsh case, Child Find of America, the Polly Klaas Foundation, smaller regional organizations. Anyone who might be able to help get Nylene's face in front of more eyes, might be able to coordinate searches or investigations in other states. Then on November 27, 1985, 2 years and 5 months after Nylene disappeared, the phone rang at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in their Arlington, Virginia office. A volunteer named Patricia Hendricks answered, expecting another routine call, a parent looking for resources, maybe a law enforcement officer requesting information about protocols. Instead, she heard a man's voice, calm and measured, with a quality that immediately made her skin prickle. "I have information about a missing girl. A girl named Kay. She's safe. She's with me. I just wanted someone to tell her family that she's okay, that she's healthy, that she's loved." Patricia's hand started shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. She signaled frantically to her supervisor while reaching to start the recording equipment they kept next to every phone for exactly this kind of situation. The line went dead before she could ask any follow-up questions. 2 months later, in early January 1986, a typewritten letter arrived at a law enforcement office in Madison, Wisconsin. Detective Robert Walsh, a 23-year veteran counting down the months until retirement, opened the envelope with no particular expectations and felt his pulse quicken as he read the first sentence. I picked Kay up on the road in the Elkhorn Park area between Helena and Boulder. She was crying and frightened, and as I held her, she was shaking, and I decided that I would keep her and love her. The geographic specificity was remarkable, not just Montana or near Helena, but the Elkhorn Park area between Helena and Boulder, which was precisely correct, but not information that had been widely publicized outside Montana. Walsh kept reading, his stomach tightening with each paragraph. I have a nice investment income, and I can work at home, so I care for her myself all the time. I teach her at home, and she likes to go with me when I travel. Her hair is short and curly now, and she has really grown. She is about 45 inches and around 50 pounds. She has all 4 of her permanent upper and 2 of her lower incisors at this time. Walsh pulled the Marshall file and started checking facts. A 4-year-old who disappeared in June 1983 would be approaching 7 years old now in January 86. 45 inches and 50 pounds were absolutely in the right range for a 7-year-old, maybe slightly on the larger side, but well within normal variation. Walsh immediately contacted FBI. Multiple phone calls followed to Child Find of America from someone claiming to be the letter writer. FBI traced the calls to phone booths in Madison and Edgerton, Wisconsin. Surveillance was set up. Then the calls stopped abruptly, completely, as if someone had flipped a switch. When Nancy Marshall received the phone call from Detective Walsh telling her about the letter, she was standing in her kitchen. She sat down hard on the floor as he explained, the phone cord stretching tight. The sound she made wasn't quite sob, wasn't quite scream. Wisconsin, Madison area. Mrs. Marshall, this is the first real break we've had in 2 years. We're going to find your daughter. But they didn't find her. Despite months of investigation, despite analyzing every word of the letter, despite surveillance and interviews and following every possible lead, the trail went cold again. The letter writer vanished back into anonymity, as completely as he'd emerged. By 1990, the Marshall family had relocated to Japan for Kim's work. By 1995, they'd moved to Mexico. On July 24, 1995, 12 years and 1 month after Nylene disappeared, Nancy Marshall was found dead in a Mexico City hotel room. Mexican police ruled it suicide by hanging, but Nancy's body showed heavy bruising, evidence of sexual assault. All jewelry missing. Friends insisted Nancy would never commit suicide. She lived for her other children, was still actively searching. Case status was eventually changed to undetermined. No arrests were made. Nancy's death remains officially unsolved. Within the family, suspicions focused on Kim. Nylene's half-sister would publicly state her belief Kim was involved in both disappearances. Despite suspicions, Kim Marshall was never charged. His current whereabouts are unknown. In 1997, a nurse in New Orleans reported a young woman calling herself Helena, the city where Nylene vanished, who stated her mother's name might be Nylene. DNA testing proved she was not Nylene Marshall. In 2026, 42 years after she vanished, Nylene K. Marshall remains missing. She was 4 years old when she followed the shadow and disappeared. She would be 47 years old now. End quote. Her case remains open. The phrase, "follow the shadow," has become the defining element of this case, representing predatory sophistication that turned abduction into game for a trusting child. Whether Nylene gone in those mountains in June 1983 or lives today unaware of her true identity, one truth remains: she deserves to have her story remembered. DNA technology offers new possibilities. Age progression images show what she might look like now. Someone somewhere knows what happened that afternoon in the Elkhorn Mountains. The purple jogging suit man was never found. The letter writer was never identified. But the search doesn't end because time passes. Room for one more piece of evidence is always open. Truth has no expiration date, and every person who remembers Nylene K. Marshall's name ensures whoever told her to follow the shadow did not succeed in making her disappear forever. The Marshall case fundamentally changed how Montana approaches search and rescue for missing children in wilderness settings. The protocols that now govern these operations were written with Nyleen's disappearance in mind, designed specifically to address the failures that allowed someone to abduct a child from a crowded meadow and vanish without leaving. Useful evidence. Modern search and rescue operations now implement rapid roadblock deployment within minutes of a missing child report. Forest Service roads are blocked. Exit routes are controlled. Law enforcement establishes a perimeter before an abductor has time to get far from the scene. This single change, born directly from the realization that Duke's scent trail ended at what was almost certainly a vehicle pickup point, has potentially prevented other abductions in the decades since. The Missing Persons Clearinghouse, run by the Montana Department of Justice, now includes real-time school registry cross-checks, specifically designed to catch situations where a child is being enrolled under a false identity or is being homeschooled in ways that avoid oversight. When a child registers for school anywhere in Montana, that registration is automatically checked against missing persons databases. Nationally, Nyleen K. Marshall was among the first 55 children featured on national television after the Adam Walsh case catalyzed the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1984. Her image appeared on milk cartons and in public service announcements and on flyers distributed to truck stops and rest areas across the country. Part of a massive shift in how American society thought about and responded to missing children. Her case helped establish the template for how missing children's cases would be publicized and investigated going forward. The immediate media blitz, the age-progressed images, updated every few years, the toll-free hotlines. For tips, the coordination between local and federal law enforcement, the involvement of nonprofit organizations specializing in missing children. Nancy Marshall's 12-year search, her absolute refusal to accept Nyleen's death without proof, her determination to keep asking questions despite threats and exhaustion, and the psychological toll reminds us that mothers don't give up. The bond between parent and child transcends time and distance, and even death. Her persistence in the face of threats demonstrates something else that's important to understand, that advocacy for missing children can be dangerous, that asking the wrong questions of the wrong people can have consequences, that the search for truth sometimes requires courage. Most of us will never be called upon to demonstrate. The threats Nancy received and her subsequent suspicious death in Mexico under circumstances that looked nothing like suicide to anyone who'd known her suggest she may have been getting close to something that someone felt threatened enough by her investigation to want her silenced permanently. In 2026, 42 years, 7 months, and 5 days after she vanished, Nyleen K. Marshall remains missing. She was 4 years old when she walked into the shadow and disappeared from that Montana meadow. She would be 47 years old now, a middle-aged woman who might have children or grandchildren of her own, who might look at her face in the mirror and wonder why she has no photographs of herself before age 5, who might dream, sometimes of mountains and cold water, and a voice calling a name she doesn't recognize as her own, or she might have no anomalous experiences at all, might be living a completely ordinary life with no reason whatsoever to question anything about her history or identity, might be one DNA test away from discovering a truth that would shatter everything she believes about who she is. Her case remains open with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, with the FBI, with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The file is still reviewed periodically by cold case detectives, hoping fresh eyes might see something previous investigators missed. Age progression images are updated every few years, showing what Nyleen might look like as she moves through middle age and beyond. Someone somewhere knows what happened that June afternoon in the Elkhorn Mountains. The purple jogging suit man, if he's still alive, is now in his 70s or 80s, possibly in declining health, possibly wrestling with conscience as death approaches. The letter writer, if he was a different person, would be similarly aged. The window for conventional justice may be closing, or may have already closed, but the window for truth remains open, as long as someone is still asking questions, still remembering, still refusing to let this case be forgotten. Tell us where you're listening from and what this story made you feel, because somewhere someone still knows what happened to Nyleen K. Marshall, and stories like hers only stay alive as long as people are willing to remember her name.